Hey everybody. Contrary to what you see in front of you here, this is not a taste test video. In fact, this is more of a discussion about everything we've learned this season, both in terms of our cold hardy citrus taste tests, as well as our outdoor testing and all of the information we've been amassing in the past year. A common question we get when it comes to hardy citrus, or maybe you've even heard it too, is whether or not they even taste good, or if they're even worth growing. A lot of people's conception of hardy citrus is low quality rootstock fruit. So I kind of want to answer that question as to whether or not hardy citrus tastes bad. And the answer to that question is a bit complicated, and it is a yes and a no. Because really it depends on which ranges of hardiness we're talking about, because cold hardiness is quite relative to where you are. What's hardy here in the southeast may not be hardy in the northeast or even the northwest. Some regions can have the same cold hardiness zones, but have entirely different lengths of freezes, which can have a big impact on whether or not certain plants can survive. So depending on where you are, some of these plant hardiness ratings may actually be quite different, and your options may be more limited than you may think. And in particular ranges of hardiness, we do see both good and bad tasting fruit. I'll show here so you guys can see the scatter plot that I put together. I posted this not long ago, and it was based on all the information I've pulled together from our taste tests, as well as general hardiness data I was able to obtain from not only our personal experiences, but also information that we found online from other people and their direct experiences, and pretty much anywhere else we could find information on these varieties. So this season we were able to taste about 35 different varieties, maybe a little bit more. And keep in mind, the information that we're basing this off of is still limited in that regard. There's a lot more than 35 different hardy citrus varieties. Citrus as a whole, there's hundreds if not thousands available and being hybridized all the time. We can't possibly test them all, but we can draw some conclusions based on the information that we do have. And ideally, as time goes on, we can do more taste tests with all these different fruit so that we can come to a stronger conclusion as to whether or not we can obtain good quality fruit in colder climates. So there's a lot to learn from the information that we have here. One of the main things is that there is an inverse correlation between cold hardiness and fruit quality. That you can see clearly on the scatter plot, which I did draw a trend line to make it more obvious as well. As you go down from positive 15 degrees Fahrenheit all the way to negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit, there is a large discrepancy, and there are certainly thresholds for how good certain fruit can taste down to a certain hardiness. One other thing we did notice is while there is an inverse correlation, it is not necessarily absolute, and it strongly depends on the varieties that were being tested, because there is a wide range of possibilities within each category. So plants that are hardy to 0 degrees and 5 degrees Fahrenheit specifically, there was up to a 30-point difference between the lowest and highest scoring fruits. That means if you have a plant that's hardy down to about 0 degrees, keep in mind these are all estimates and they've all been rounded, but you could have a plant that is hardy to that and produces fruit that have scored, based on our objective score sheet, up to 60, maybe even mid-60s. And you can also have a fruit that scores as low as in the 30s, maybe even below that, but that could be your 30-point range there. And when we keep in mind the fact that some of the best fruit, like some of the most dessert quality fruit like satsumas, changshas, karaji, a lot of those mandarins and oranges, some of those were scoring in the 80s. We even got one, I believe, one of the satsumas scored over a 90, which is really good. But if we're getting fruit that are scoring in the 60s and they're hardy to 0, whereas these plants, it varies, but they might not tolerate much below 15 without severe damage. And it certainly gets much worse below that point. So if we're getting fruit that are of that quality but can tolerate temperatures much, much lower, that's quite good. And again, depending on where you're growing, that may be good enough for you. Because the reason we grow hardy citrus, well, one, we're a bit crazy. We're trying to grow plants where they shouldn't be. But they do also bring in a lot of ornamental value. A lot of these citrus, whether or not they're hardy, they still look equally beautiful in the spring and summer with their flowers and fruit. But if you live in a colder area and you can't grow conventional citrus, maybe you can grow hardy citrus that, sure, might score lower in most metrics, but are still plenty good for you and your purposes. Once these fruits score around 60, if not a little bit more than that, I consider them personally, and a lot of people will agree by this point, I consider them to be very usable fruit in the kitchen. Not necessarily for fresh eating, but that goes the same for a lot of commercial acid citrus. You're not going to eat a lemon and lime out of hand. And I bet if I did the scores for these fruit, they might not score much beyond the 70s. In fact, they'd probably score in the 60s if I had to guess, which puts them not far off from some of our better scoring fruit that got down to the 5-degree range, like the yuzu, for instance, which has been gaining popularity. It scored a 66, which is quite good considering what we also saw in person when we tested the yuzu, that it seems very reliably hardy, at least down to 10 degrees we saw. It goes into dormancy very well, which is perfect for areas like ours where temperatures can fluctuate a lot. And it does seem rather resistant to sunburn and desiccation and things of that like. But I've also heard reports that it struggles more in northern climates where freezes are more prolonged. However, that's very impressive that it can score that high. And another great example in this 5-degree range, mostly because we're not sure if it's hardy down to lower, but I suspect it is the Iva Swingle Citramello. If you guys remember from that taste test, that was essentially a larger swingle, and it was a zygotic seedling, we suspect, of swingle, so it varied from the original type, but it had much higher quality fruit that was, again, larger, juicier, fruitier in taste, and it had less bitterness, less acidity, more sugar. It had all the improvements you'd want in a Citramello, and it quickly rose to the top of our chart, even surpassing Dunstan, which in fairness, Dunstan had an off year, but Dunstan is exceptionally hardy, and probably one of your best tasting options that's hardy down to close to 0 degrees. If not, we rounded it to the 0-degree category because there's multiple instances of Dunstan surviving that as a more mature tree. So what's exceptional about those is they aren't even standard citrus. Those are 50% trifoliate orange hybrids, which makes a really big difference. And that's one of the challenges in why people think hardy citrus can be inferior in taste, and they often are in a lot of regards. Hybridizing with the trifoliate orange, no matter what, tends to create fruit with a higher degree of bitterness, acidity, more seeds, and other off flavors that maybe you can't quite describe, because they do have higher concentrations of flavonoids that are not found as normally in some of your commercial citrus. So you'll get unusual floral and pine flavors that you'd never see in normal citrus. And that can make a lot of them taste fairly unusual. So of course, then the challenge is, how do we get these 50% hybrids, which are fairly cold hardy? A lot of them meet the two varieties halfway, where if you have a trifoliate orange that's hardy to -15 and a satsuma or whatever that's hardy to 15 or so, the resulting hybrid is then hardy to closer to 0 degrees. Doesn't always work that way, but it tends to be pretty close with those first generation hybrids. But then they all suffer from, well, if the hardiness met halfway, so did the taste. And that's the challenge. But one thing we've noticed is that in second generation hybrids, that hasn't been the case. It can bias one way or the other. You can have better or worse flavor and better or worse hardiness, and they are not necessarily linked. Though they are strongly correlated, they are not inseparable. And again, Iva Swingle Citramello is an example where we don't know its exact hardiness, but it's lived for many years in South Carolina with no issues. So it's probably hardy to at least 5 degrees for short durations, but possibly lower. So even if it's not exactly as hardy as Swingle, which is good down to close to 0 degrees, it is a notable improvement in flavor without a huge sacrifice in hardiness, which gives me a lot of hope for future hybrids like the Conestoga 058, which you guys might remember. That one has primarily monofoliate leaves and primarily citrus characteristics, but its hardiness is similar to maybe one of the less hardy citrandrins. It's hardy to single digits, but it will experience dieback below that. And it has survived down to -11, -12 degrees, but it did originally die back to the ground. However, it's completely monofoliate. Its leaves smell great. The plant looks like a normal citrus with the exception of its huge thorns, which even then are common on a lot of standard seedling citrus. So it shows a lot of potential as a second generation hybrid. And in the same way, there's other Conestoga selections. So these were all C35 hybrid seedlings, but in that second generation, there was some that actually represented their trifoliate orange parentage much more, to the point where they're almost indistinguishable. And in our taste tests, these fruit, while being almost as hardy, and we haven't confirmed, but they could even be as hardy as trifoliate orange, but they did score a little bit higher. Generally, they had maybe a little bit more citrus taste, some thinner rinds. 026 had more of an orange flavor, whereas 010 had reduced resin. They all had some sort of minor improvement over standard trifoliate orange, while looking and being nearly as hardy and looking very similar. Even to trained eyes, they look like trifoliate orange. It's fascinating, actually, that can even happen. But it shows, for example, the range of possibilities in these second generations and what we're trying to target by selecting seedlings from a lot of hybrid fruit. And even when it comes to breeding, we're not always even necessarily breeding for that first generation, but sometimes we're breeding for that second generation where we can have a redistribution in these genes and ideally in our favor. Now, something I did want to touch on as we're talking about breeding in these citrus that survived such crazy temperatures, I want to talk about the Prague Chimera quickly, because you will notice on the chart as well, the Prague is an exception to the rule, and in a good way. The Prague Chimera is a Satsuma trifoliate orange chimera, not a hybrid, where that cellular mixture arranged in a way where we have a plant that is primarily composed of trifoliate orange, but the Satsuma cells that are there are contributing to those parts that are producing the fruit, and you get good quality mandarins on a very robust and hardy plant. So it could tolerate probably down to 0 degrees as well, similar to a citrandrin, which would be a hybrid between the two. So it has similar hardiness in that regard, but it retains the dessert quality fruit. That is a very rare exception that we haven't quite been able to achieve with standard hybrids. And that is something I want to be very clear about. I think it's an unrealistic expectation that we can breed dessert quality fruit that are hardy down to around 0 degrees as well. There will always be some sort of compromise at that level. But given these wide ranges that we're seeing in the hybrids, where you could have something that is at least usable in the kitchen and has a lot less off flavor, a lot more juice, less seeds, whatever the case, there's still a lot of potential. But chimeras operate very differently. And that is partly the reason why, as a side project, I am pursuing creating a chimera with other citrus like the yuzu or the karaji mandarin. I want to see if it's possible to get other fruit that are high quality on extremely hardy plants to kind of bypass this area that we haven't quite been able to get past yet. And kind of following that further, we have to keep that in mind, especially for the sub-zero ranges. So if we're breeding for plants that are hardy down to below 0, well, again, your options are very limited, at least based on what we currently have available. Most of what you have is going to be, maybe at best, an okay substitute for a lemon. Even then, it's still hard to compare it exactly, because primarily what's hardy to below 0 is going to be trifoliate orange, second generation hybrids that strongly resemble trifoliate orange, and potentially 75% trifoliate orange hybrids, which aren't really discussed about, and there aren't many that I at least know of in circulation. However, theoretically, they would do a very good job at these temperatures, while of course still sacrificing some hardiness. They may not be good down to -15 or -20, but they might be good down to -5 or -10. We're not exactly sure, and it hasn't been studied a lot. But I do think Mel's work in Pennsylvania with the Conestogas will eventually yield something along those lines, where we get something of more notably improved quality. Even amongst the trifoliate oranges, we have the Pancerus Plus, which was a strain selected in Europe that made its way overseas as a seed, and then now we have Pancerus Plus in the US, which we did the taste test on the US version, which the seedlings do tend to vary. Some have more or less resin, but we got lucky enough that we have a fruiting strain that did have drastically reduced resin content. If you guys remember, when I sliced those fruit open in that video, I was able to wipe it off the knife without any residual resin left behind. And that's one of the biggest limiting factors to trifoliate orange for its use in the kitchen, is that resin content. It can have an unusual taste. It can be a weird blend of lemon, and maybe even lime, some people have detected, but more like a lemon, orange, and grapefruit mix. And then you get some pine flavors, which are primarily from that resin that's in it, those oils. So having a fruit with reduced content of those is a notable improvement. It still tastes different than any normal citrus you might be used to. However, it's much more usable. And it does in fact make a very good lemonade. We've made lemonade out of trifoliate orange that, to the untrained taste buds, is perfectly acceptable as a beverage. Which is promising for those of you in colder zones, because sure, you might not be able to grow lemons or limes or oranges, but you could still have a very beautiful citrus outdoors that provides some use in the kitchen. So even if the fruit tastes bad, you can still process them further and use them for preserves. You could use them in place of a lemon if you're preserving or canning or doing anything like that. You can even use them in desserts, use them as a key lime substitute. It is different, however, it's still quite good, and you grew it by yourself, which of course is always a plus. But it is an area where I wish, and we are limited because we do live in North Carolina, I wish I could contribute further and breed something of better quality that could survive such low temperatures. However, I'm going to have to leave that up to you guys in those regions to do some of that work. And hopefully with the resources we have available, I can make that a little bit easier and guide you along so you know which direction to take things. I do see there being potential though. Again, not dessert quality, but perhaps maybe closer approaching the quality of some of those low to mid-range fruit that are hardy down to the 0-degree range. If I refer to my chart here, some of the lower ranking fruit that were hardy to 0 degrees you might consider being the Thai Citradia. There's also the Dragon Lime and the Rusk Citrange, even the Swingle Citramelo, which some people find to be a very acceptable lemon substitute. Ornamentally, that and the Thai both look great as lemon-type trees. However, of course, taste-wise, they do fall a bit short of a true lemon. But there is the ability to approach at least those, which are even more usable in the kitchen than a trifoliate orange would be. And another thing to keep in mind too, which it's something I've mentioned casually in discussion with people about our personal breeding efforts, is there are some exceptions, some of those higher ranking fruit that also have really good hardiness despite not even being 50-50 trifoliate orange hybrids. One of those is the Thomasville Citrange Quat, which is a 25% orange, 25% trifoliate orange, and 50% kumquat hybrid. So it only has 25% trifoliate orange, but it has held its ground down to 5 degrees in a lot of areas, and for us down to 10 degrees as a first-year plant with, actually, in my opinion, pretty wimpy growth. We're going to try and grow some thicker specimens for next year, but they just wanted to flower so profusely. We didn't even get very good growth on ours, and they still held up down to 10 degrees along with some of those other hybrids. So they still carry a lot of potential despite having less trifoliate genetics, and that's because of those kumquat genes. And kumquat genes aren't the only ones that are significant in this regard, but yuzu and I-Chang pepita also seem to show a lot of potential, being some of the hardiest non-trifoliate fruit that we've tested in terms of taste and hardiness. One thing that these all have in common is they have very strong winter dormancy. So, because of that kumquat, because of that yuzu, that I-Chang pepita, these plants go to sleep for the winter and stop growing and lignify. They harden their growth sooner than even some of the 50% hybrids, like some of the citranges or even the citramellos, which we noticed can continue growing into the fall and be more susceptible to damage, which is not a good quality and something we'd ideally like to breed out, especially as we try and push things further. But the Thomasville Citrange Quat ranks relatively high. It scored a 68 despite being hardy down to around 5 degrees or so. And again, it depends on the circumstances, but otherwise one of the only limiting factors is the Thomasville Citrange Quat tends to have to be picked at the green stage, where it's better off as a lime substitute. It ripens its fruit probably by late January and going into February when they are at their best for fresh eating quality. But of course, in a lot of zones that do get down to 5 degrees, you've already had more than a few frosts by that point. And the fruit are hardy down to the lower 20s. However, odds are you will see even lower temperatures than that, especially by January and February, where it's often the coldest. But the fruit even being used as a lime substitute are actually quite good. Thomasville as a lime substitute is better than trifoliate orange as a lemon substitute. That is for sure. It is still very useful though. I've heard lots of great things about people using these for pies and other situations where you might use a lime. And if you do happen to grow them out all the way, we have some in our unheated greenhouse. Those fruit are quite enjoyable too. So I do think there is potential in that area for breeding with kumquat and yuzu and other citrus like that, other hybrids of those, with trifoliate and trifoliate hybrids because we're essentially mixing both worlds. We're getting all the best traits of dormancy while also importantly retaining edibility. That's the other part I didn't cover so much here. While these all have excellent dormancy, they also seem to, at least in part, negate some of the negative attributes of trifoliate orange in terms of taste. So kumquat seems to override the trifoliate, where it actually makes the peels more edible and less bitter, which typically they end up being more bitter than even normal citrus, which good luck eating a rind on one of these, it's terrible. But kumquats manage to bypass that, and most hybrids that have some kumquat in them, the peels become edible. It's one of the amazing things about it. And that affects not only the peel, but even the albedo and some of the internal parts of the fruit can become more edible. And while it doesn't quite work the same with the yuzu and ichang pepita, the albedo in those fruit, the white part and other interior components, are actually still quite edible. I've eaten the peel on a yuzu and it wasn't bad. And even in ichang pepita, the albedo was mild, even lightly sweet maybe, but it wasn't bad even on fruit that had no juice inside. And this passes on to their offspring, to any hybrids you make with these fruit, where they will have less bitterness in these parts of the fruit that are normally more bitter. So that's very significant when you factor that they can add more edibility while also maintaining and contributing important aspects to the hardiness of these plants. So they don't even have to fully be 50% trifoliate hybrids, and they can still be extremely hardy. But there's probably even combinations where you could probably hybridize an orange quat with the trifoliate orange and get that higher contribution of trifoliate while still getting perhaps enough kumquat to improve that taste a good degree. There's a lot of unexplored hybrids that we just don't know about. And again, keep that in mind as you're interpreting these results too. We've only done 35 taste tests, and even as we do more, that's only on the varieties that exist and are in circulation. As more are bred, and as we breed our own, ideally we'll expand on a lot of these ranges, and we will notice exceptional outliers that are not just chimeras, but hybrids that truly rank higher in each respective category. Perhaps we could see a 5 to 10 point jump all across the range, anywhere between -15 and close to 10 degrees where fruit starts to really improve. We could see a lot of jumps where perhaps we might get our first fruit that ranks close to 70, if not 70, around that 0 to 5 degree range, especially towards that 0 degree range where we're currently topped out around 60 or so. And again, that being the Dunstan Citramelo, where the 5 degree range, the Iva Swingle Citramelo leads there. So you might be noticing the Citramelos, some of the better ones at least, have held those top spots in those categories, but they do still have some notable downsides and some things we still have to work on breeding out. And that's why perhaps even a Citramelo and Yuzu hybrid or something of that like would be very good. And there is one that exists in Europe that I found out about recently, and I can see something like that having a lot of potential because it really blends a lot of those good aspects we're looking for. But otherwise, Citrandarans typically have been some of the best hybrids that are good down to 0 degrees. Well, Satsumas and Citrandarans, although Satsumas have been more limited, there is one in particular, the Maihawasi Satsuma and Pansaris hybrid. That one seems to show some promise in having some interesting pineapple flavors, which can sometimes come out in some of these hybrids, sometimes in 50%, but we've even seen this with US 119, which I believe is a 25% hybrid, and also has some of those tastes where you get just enough pininess to contribute that without fully taking it away. It blends with the other sweetness and other flavors in those fruits, making for a unique flavor experience. And that's one thing too. While we're working on breeding the best quality fruit we can have in terms of being both dessert quality or even just useful in the kitchen in other ways, there's a lot of other unique tastes that we can go for. And there's a lot of other flavors that can be unlocked that might not necessarily be familiar to us, but can certainly be a very rewarding and enjoyable experience when it comes to these fruit. So we don't necessarily have to reinvent what already exists, but just make it hardy. But we could have entirely new fruit. We just have to target the aspects of these fruit that are less desirable. So we want less bitterness or less acidity, less seediness, stickiness, whatever the case is, anything that detracts from that eating experience, that's what we're targeting to the best of our abilities. But hopefully this all makes sense to you guys. This was a bit of a longer talk about hardiness and fruit quality, but if you stayed through it, you might understand now some of the challenges we face and how to really interpret fruit quality as it relates to hardiness. And you can see why we might answer yes and no, because it really does depend. There are truly good and bad fruit in their respective hardiness categories and relative to their hardiness. Even if a fruit ranks lower, you might consider it better if it's one of your few options you can actually grow in your area. And that's perfectly okay. You don't have to like all of them, but if some of them are valuable to you, even if someone else doesn't like them, that's perfectly okay. And there's always going to be cases like that. I know in our area we can get away with some of the better hybrids, so I don't have to worry about growing a Troy or Citrange, which is probably one of my least favorite hybrids. But in some areas, maybe that is one of your few options. Maybe it does do well in your climate, in your soil, and everything like that. And the tree is beautiful, I just don't like the fruit too much. But they can still be useful. And on a commercial scale, they actually do still use a lot of these rootstock fruit for extracting certain flavonoids, the sugars, the pectin, everything like that. And even in Florida, where they're struggling with citrus diseases, these rootstock fruit can still provide them a source of income by being able to extract those compounds from the fruit without having to worry about fruit taste. You could just grow whatever grows there. Keep in mind too, when it comes to the world of breeding hardy citrus and rootstock fruit, we're behind by decades, if not more, in terms of breeding efforts for hardy citrus, because those efforts haven't been targeted towards making better tasting fruit for these colder areas. Once they figured out that, generally speaking, the fruit had a lot of off flavors that they were trying to breed originally for better taste and hardiness, they used them as rootstock. They grafted other citrus onto them to take advantage of that enhanced vigor and the disease resistance and their ability to grow in these different soils, like trifoliate orange, which had all of these qualities. But when you combined it with normal citrus and then grafted citrus onto these hybrids, well, what do you know? They did really good, and they took a lot of those positive aspects from both of them and put it together. So all of the effort after that point has really been put towards breeding better rootstock to enhance the fruit we have currently, to impart hardiness, to impart disease resistance, to be able to grow these citrus on a mass scale in the areas where they are successful. But that kind of takes the fun out of it, in my opinion. I do think, again, while we know our limitations, there is still a lot of room to push citrus further north and into safer ranges, which is a big part of my motivation with this stuff, is I want the ability and I want to be able to help protect the citrus industry by creating varieties that can survive in colder climates without fear of these diseases and these pests that are present in these warmer climates and these states that are quarantined for things like HLB. This has been a big problem with the citrus industry, and they are developing solutions to this, and they are getting better. But there is still a lot to learn there, and they still have a lot of work to be done. But they will figure it out. However, I think it's almost easier in a way to take advantage of the natural variation that exists within these fruit and the trifoliate orange itself, and use it to the best of our ability to breed fruit that can handle these climates naturally and do so much easier than the levels of management that are required to cultivate them in these warmer climates where these other pressures do exist. So that is a big part of our motivation. I'm sure some of you may feel the same about this too. So let me know in the comments what you think about the stuff we talked about in this video. Let me know what you're doing if you're also breeding. I'm always curious to hear your guys' thoughts in your own projects. And let me know, what hardy citrus do you think tastes good or taste bad? It's important to get as many opinions about these things as possible because biases do exist. And we try and control for those biases with our taste tests by eliminating most of these subjective data. We try and make it primarily objective, things we can't control, like fruit size, seeds, acidity, sweetness, bitterness. By taking those variables and making them encompass the majority of these taste tests, we try and keep our information as objective as possible. But there is still going to be some personal bias. We are still enthusiastic about hardy citrus. We do still sell hardy citrus. So it's important to keep that in mind for the areas that are prone to that subjectiveness. We have to consider everyone's opinions as it comes to these fruit, and there's going to be some things that other people detect that some people won't. Everyone has a different experience with hardy citrus. To my surprise, a lot of it has been positive, but it strongly depends on what you're dealing with. Anyways, we'll wrap it up there, guys. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you as always for sticking around for these longer talks, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.